This is a story about a village in the desert hills west of Thebes, a small, walled settlement of whitewashed houses and narrow streets tucked into a valley where the cliffs rose pale and jagged against the sky. And the ordinary people who lived there during the long reign of the pharaoh Ramesses, painters and draftsmen, stonecutters and scribes, mothers, enchantresses, and children, who spent their lives building tombs meant to last forever, and who, on their days of rest, built something just as beautiful for themselves. The Egyptians called this place Set Mat, the place of truth, and the men and women who lived there called themselves servants in the place of truth. Though their work was anything but servile, they were among the finest artists and craftsmen in all of Egypt, entrusted with the most sacred task the kingdom knew, the making of the pharaoh's house of eternity, deep in the hidden valley to the north that we now call the Valley of the Kings. But our story does not begin in that valley, or in the tomb, or even inside the village walls. It begins on a hillside just above them, where a man named Nebnefer stood in the early light of morning with a brush of bundled reed in one hand and a clay shell of red ochre in the other, studying a freshly plastered wall. He had been standing there for some time. The plaster was smooth and pale, still faintly cool to the touch, and it waited for him the way a blank surface always waits, with patience and with a kind of quiet demand. Nebnefer was a draftsman, a seshked, and he had spent more than 30 years drawing the outlines that other men filled with color. In the royal tomb, his work was guided by the words of the scribe and the traditions passed down across generations, the precise proportions of a god's body, the angle of a pharaoh's striding leg, the way the sky goddess Nut stretched her painted body across a ceiling so that the stars fell from her like water. He knew these forms the way a man knows the sound of his own breathing. His hand could draw them in near darkness by the flicker of a single oil lamp 80 paces underground. But this wall was not inside a tomb built for a king. This was the chapel of his own family's burial place, a small vaulted room of mud brick and stone, topped with a steep little pyramid no taller than a man on the terraced hillside where the artisans of the village buried their own. And here, for the first time in his long career, no scribe had laid out the guidelines. No foreman had approved the composition. The wall belonged to him and to his wife, Merit, and to the children they had raised in the narrow house below. He dipped the brush and began. The first stroke was the horizon line, the boundary between the earth and the fields of eternity. Below it, in time, he would paint the dark, rich soil of the blessed afterlife. Above it, the golden grain of the fields of Yaru, the paradise where the righteous dead harvested crops that never failed beneath a sun that never set. He had seen this scene painted 100 times. He had drawn it for other men's tombs in exchange for sandals or linen or jars of good oil. But drawing it for himself was different. Every choice meant something that it did not mean when the work was for someone else. What color for the sky? How tall to make the grain? Whether to show himself and Merit alone or surrounded by their children, and if so, which children and how? He worked slowly, sketching the faintest outlines, the bones of the scene, while the sky above the valley brightened from gray to rose to the first pale gold of the Egyptian morning. Below him, the village was waking. The sounds rose like heat, a baby crying, the low rhythmic scraping of grain being ground, the voices of women calling to one another across the rooftops. The village was small, perhaps 70 houses arranged along a single narrow street, pressed close together behind a mud brick wall. The houses were modest but solid, built on stone foundations, their outer walls painted white, their wooden doors sometimes carved with the owner's name. High windows let in light without letting in the worst of the heat, and the street that ran the length of the village was covered in places with palm frond awnings, so that walking it felt like passing through a series of warm, shaded rooms. Nebnefer could see the roof of his own house from here, the flat top where Merit sometimes sat in the evenings, where the children had slept on the hottest nights of Shemu, when the air inside was too close to bear. The house had 4 rooms. The front room with its painted platform and the small shrine niche where Merit kept figures of Hathor and Taweret and a painted stela of Amenhotep, the village's patron. The main room where the family gathered and ate. The 2 smaller rooms behind it, one of which still held Panahisi's sleeping mat, and the kitchen at the back, where the bread oven radiated heat into the mud brick walls and the steps led down to the cool cellar below. He heard Merit's voice before he saw her. She had sent Bakatmut, the eldest of the servant women assigned to their household by the administration, up the hillside path to call him down. Bakatmut was breathing hard by the time she reached the chapel. The path was steep, cut into the hillside in rough steps, and she delivered the message with the weary directness of a woman who had been grinding grain since before dawn. The bread was ready, the beer was poured, and if he wanted to eat before the sun made the walk back down unbearable, he should come now. Nebnefer cleaned his brush, covered the ochre, and followed her down. Merit had set the morning meal in the main room of the house, where the light from the high windows fell in slanted bars across the mud brick floor. There was bread, the dense round loaves she baked in the domed oven out back, and beer in a wide ceramic cup, thick and sweet and faintly sour, the kind she brewed herself and supervised with the same exacting attention she brought to everything in the household. There were onions and dried fish and a small dish of oil for dipping. It was a rest day meal, unhurried, and Merit sat with him while he ate. She was a woman of 50 or near it, her hair still dark but threaded with gray, her hands strong and precise from decades of the work that kept a household running in this village. The bread-making, the brewing, the spinning and weaving, the management of grain stores and barter goods, the quiet daily accounting that determined whether a family ate well or went without. She held the title of Nebet Per, mistress of the house, and at Deir el-Medina this was not merely a courtesy. The women who bore this title managed the domestic economy with real authority, and Merit managed hers with a competence that Nebnefer had long since learned not to question. She also held a title that belonged to a different part of her life. She was a chantress of Hathor, a Shemayet, at the small chapel near the northern end of the village, and in this role she sang the hymns and shook the sistrum during the goddess's rites, her voice joining with the other women who served the chapel in a music that was, to them, as essential and as ordinary as the grinding of grain. It was not a priesthood exactly, but it was a position of standing held most often by the wives of the senior men, the foremen and scribes and master craftsmen, and Merit carried it with the same quiet seriousness she brought to everything else. She asked him about the tomb, their tomb, not the pharaoh's, the one on the hillside. He told her he had begun the horizon line, the first marks of the fields of Yaru. She nodded and said nothing for a moment, and then she said that she hoped he would remember to leave room for the sycamore tree. There should be a sycamore, she said, with nut reaching out from its branches to offer bread and water to the dead. It was a scene she had always loved in other people's chapels, and she wanted it in theirs. Nebuchadnezzar said he would remember. He had already been thinking of it. From the back of the house came the sound of Panahesi waking, the scuff of a sleeping mat, a long exhale, the particular silence of a young man gathering himself before the day begins. He was 17, the youngest of their surviving children, lean and quiet, with his mother's dark, watchful eyes and his father's long-fingered hands. In 2 days the work week would begin, and Panahesi would walk to the mountain camp for the first time as a member of the gang, the crew of artisans who cut and decorated the royal tombs. He had been accepted as an apprentice at the start of Akhet, and he had spent the season preparing, grinding pigments, practicing the hieratic script, sketching on ostraca until the limestone chips piled up beside his mat like a drift of pale leaves. He was ready, or he believed he was, and the restlessness in him was like a rope pulled taut. He came into the room and sat down and reached for the bread without speaking, and Merit watched him the way she sometimes watched the bread as it baked, with attention, with patience, and with the knowledge that some things cannot be hurried. Let us leave the village for a moment and follow a different path, not up into the desert hills, but down, away from the cliffs and the dry, pale stone, down to where the land softens and greens and the air carries the heavy, fertile smell of the river. Here, in a small house of mudbrick near the edge of the cultivation, where the fields of emmer wheat were just beginning to push their green blades through the dark, silted earth left behind by the retreating flood, a man named Amenemope rose before dawn and began to prepare for the day's work. His house was simpler than the ones inside the village walls. 2 rooms, a cooking area open to the sky, a small yard where the neighbor's goat sometimes wandered in to chew the rope that held the gate. He lived alone. He had been married once, years ago, but his wife had returned to her family in a village further south, and they had parted without children and without rancor, in the way that sometimes happens when 2 people discover that the life they'd imagined together was not the one they were actually living. He had not remarried. The work kept him busy, and the solitude had settled around him like a garment that fit well enough. Amenemope was a water carrier, an Imam, one of the SMDT, the servants of the tomb, who supplied the village of Deir el-Medina with the things it could not provide for itself. The village was built in the desert, away from the river, away from the green land, tucked into its dry valley for reasons of secrecy and proximity to the royal tombs. Everything the villagers needed, water, fish, vegetables, firewood, pottery, clean laundry, had to be carried in from outside. And of all these necessities, water was the most constant and the most essential. Every morning, Amenemope filled tall clay jars from the canal that ran through the fields near his home, a channel fed by the river, its banks soft with mud and fringed with reeds where herons stood motionless in the shallows. He loaded the jars 2 at a time into rope cradles slung across the backs of donkeys. The donkeys were not his own. A water carrier's wages, paid in grain like everyone else's, were not enough to buy a donkey, and so he rented them from the village workmen, paying a portion of his monthly ration for the use of their animals. It was an arrangement that worked well enough, though the economics of it meant that Amenemope would never be anything more than what he was. The donkeys knew the path. They had walked it so many times that their hooves had worn smooth grooves into the limestone where the trail climbed away from the green land and up into the pale, dry hills. The walk took the better part of an hour. He left while the sky was still dark in the west and brightening in the east, and by the time he reached the village the sun was above the eastern cliffs and the shadows were pulling back from the valley floor like water draining from a basin. The path was familiar to him in every detail, every stone, every turning, the place where the acacia tree grew sideways out of a crack in the rock, the point where the smell of the green land finally gave way to the dry mineral scent of the desert. He had walked it nearly every day for more than 10 years. He had not always been a water carrier. There had been a time, and it was not so long ago that the memory had faded, though it was long enough ago that it sometimes felt like a story about someone else, when Amenemope had been a member of the gang. A stonecutter assigned to the left side of the crew, working in the deep chambers of the royal tomb where the rock was still rough and the air was thick with dust. He had been taken on during a period of expansion, when the new pharaoh's tomb required more hands, and he had worked beside men like Nebnefer, slept in the same mountain camp, eaten the same meals delivered from the village. He had been part of the crew for nearly 5 years. Then, the work had shifted. The tomb moved from the cutting phase to the decorating phase. Fewer stonecutters were needed. The foreman had received orders from the vizier to reduce the gang, and Amenemope had been among those sent outside, reassigned to the SMDT, the support workers who lived beyond the village walls. It was not a punishment, and it carried no shame exactly. It was simply the way the system worked. When the cutting was done, the cutters were no longer needed, and the administration of the tomb was nothing if not efficient. Some of the displaced men had found positions as guardians or doorkeepers. Amenemope had become a water carrier. He remembered the day he had walked out through the village gate for the last time as a member of the gang. The strange lightness of it, the way the familiar street had looked suddenly different, as though he were seeing it from the wrong side of a window. He had been given his final grain ration by the deputy and had carried it home to the house by the river, and the next morning he had loaded the donkeys and begun the walk that he had been making ever since. He did not think about it every day, but some mornings when the path was quiet and the donkeys moved at their own unhurried pace and the village appeared above him on the hillside, the white walls, the little pyramids on the tombs, the covered street where he had once lived, he felt it, not bitterness, something quieter than that, an awareness of the line between inside and outside, and of which side he stood on. The cistern was just beyond the north gate of the village, a wide funnel-shaped basin of plastered stone about 2 paces across, set into the small square where the women gathered in the mornings. Amenemope unloaded the jars and poured the water carefully, watching it settle into the basin where it would be drawn throughout the day, carried into the houses in smaller vessels, used for drinking, for cooking, for mixing the bread dough, for washing the children's faces. The water he brought was the village's lifeline. Without it, there was no bread, no beer, no plaster mixed for walls, no pigment ground for paint. Everything began with the water. He had just finished emptying the last jar when Nebnefer came down the path from the hillside, his hands still faintly stained with ochre, his tools wrapped in a linen cloth under his arm. The two men saw each other, and there was the brief, particular pause that happens between people who share a history that neither of them needs to explain. Nebnepher greeted him. Amenemope asked after his health, after merit. Nebnepher asked about the river, whether the flood had pulled back fully, whether the fields were planted. They spoke the way men speak, who have known each other for a long time, and who do not need to fill the silence with words that serve no purpose. There was warmth in it, and a kind of respect that had outlasted the change in their positions. Nebnepher had never been the sort of man who treated the support workers as though they were invisible, and Amenemope had never been the sort who resented the men who had kept their places in the gang. What lay between them was simpler than that, the memory of shared labor, of nights in the mountain camp, of the particular bond that forms between men who have worked together underground in the dark, in the silence, doing something that mattered. They spoke for a few minutes, no more. Then Amenemope gathered his donkeys and turned back toward the path, and Nebnepher went in through the gate to his morning meal, and the day continued in the way that days do when the rhythms are established and the work is steady and the season is about to turn. The inundation was nearly over, the river was pulling back into its banks. The air had just begun to carry the first faint edge of coolness that signaled the coming of pharaoh, the season of emergence, when the earth dried and the fields greened and the work in the tombs went forward at full pace. In the village, the women were already preparing for the shift, adjusting the stores, calculating rations, planning the brewing schedule. On the hillside, the family tombs stood in their neat rows with their small pyramids catching the morning light. In the Valley of the Kings, beyond the ridge, the corridors of the pharaoh's tomb stretched deeper into the mountain, waiting for the draughtsmen and the painters to return. Pharaoh was coming, the season of growing things, the season of emergence. And for a young man named Panahesi, lying on his sleeping mat in the back room of his father's house with his hands behind his head and his eyes open in the half-light, it could not come soon enough. The men left before the stars had faded. They gathered in the small square outside the north gate, the same square where Amenemope filled the cistern each morning, though at this hour the basin was a dark circle in the ground, and the village behind them was a row of pale shapes against the hillside, lit only by the last oil lamps guttering in a few doorways. The foreman of the left side of the gang, a broad, weathered man named Kaimwaset, counted heads by voice, calling names into the darkness and listening for the answers. And when he was satisfied, he turned without ceremony and started up the path. There were perhaps 30 men in the group, though it was difficult to count them in the dark. They walked in a loose column, their sandals scuffing on the limestone, their tools and provisions bundled in linen cloths carried across their shoulders or tied to their backs. Some carried their own water skins. A few carried nothing at all and walked with the easy, unhurried gait of men who had made this journey so many times that it no longer required thought. Panahesi walked near the middle of the group. He had barely slept. He had lain on his mat through the last hours of the night, listening to the sounds of the house, his mother's breathing in the next room, the faint scrape of a mouse in the cellar, the distant bark of a dog somewhere beyond the village walls. And when the knock had come at the door in the darkness before dawn, he had been on his feet before the sound had finished. Merit had risen too, though she did not need to. She had pressed bread and a handful of dried dates into his hands and touched his face once, quickly, the way she might touch a jar to test whether the clay was still warm from the kiln. Nebnifer was already outside, waiting. He had said very little, only that Panahesi should walk where he was told to walk, and watch what he was told to watch, and keep his hands ready and his mouth quiet until he understood how things worked. It was not unkindness. It was the voice his father used in the mornings before work, stripped of everything domestic, already belonging to the tomb. Now they climbed. The path rose steeply from the village, switchbacking up the hillside through loose scree and between outcrops of pale limestone that loomed in the pre-dawn light like the shoulders of buried animals. The air was cool, Peret's gift, and carried the dry, clean scent of stone and dust and the faintest trace of something green from the valley far below. The men climbed in near silence. There was no talking on the path, not because it was forbidden, but because the steepness took the breath, and because the quiet of the hour seemed to ask for quiet in return. Panahesi could see his father ahead of him, a dark shape moving with the steady, unhurried rhythm of a man who knew exactly where to place his feet. Nebnifer climbed the way he did everything, without waste, without show, each step precisely where it needed to be. Behind Panahesi, he could hear the heavier breathing of Hay, who climbed with the rolling, muscular effort of a stonecutter, his broad shoulders swaying as he worked his way up the slope. Hay had found Panahesi in the square before they set out and had stood beside him in the dark with the comfortable ease of a man who remembered his own first morning and saw no reason to make a fuss about someone else's. He had pointed out where to stand in the column, not at the front where the senior men walked and not at the back where stragglers drew the foreman's attention, but in the middle where an apprentice could watch and learn and stay out of the way. He had told Panahesi that the climb took less than an hour and that the worst of it was the coal near the top, where the path narrowed to a ledge and the ground fell away on both sides. He said this not to frighten him, but in the way that a man describes a stretch of river to someone who has not yet traveled it, simply, practically, so that when it comes it is not a surprise. They reached the col as the sky was changing. The darkness had lifted into a deep, luminous blue, and the eastern horizon was beginning to burn, a line of molten gold above the distant cliffs on the far side of the Nile, spreading upward into bands of amber and rose. The path here was narrow, perhaps a pace and a half across, cut into the spine of the ridge that separated the village's valley from the great wadi beyond. To the left, the ground dropped away toward the south, and Panahesi could see, far below, impossibly far below, the dark geometric shapes of the mortuary temples along the edge of the cultivation. The columns of Hatshepsut's great temple nestled against the cliff face, the massive walls of the Ramesseum, and beyond them the green strip of the farmland, and the river itself, a broad silver curve in the early light. To the right, the ground fell more gradually toward the north, into a landscape of dry wadis and eroded limestone hills, and somewhere beyond them, hidden in its valley, the entrance to the royal necropolis where the pharaohs slept in their painted corridors beneath the mountain. And above everything, at the highest point of the ridge, the peak of Meretseger rose like a natural pyramid against the brightening sky. Meretseger, she who loves silence, the cobra goddess of the Theban hills, whose mountain watched over both the living and the dead. The artisans of the village knew her well. They carved her image, prayed to her, left offerings at her shrines. She was the protector of the necropolis and the punisher of those who swore false oaths, and her silence was the silence of the mountain itself, vast and patient and absolute. Panahesi looked up at the peak and felt something he could not have named settle over him, like a hand pressed gently against his chest. They descended the far side of the ridge along a path worn smooth by generations of feet, and the mountain camp came into view. It was smaller than Panahesi had imagined, a collection of low stone walls, some no higher than a man's waist, arranged in a rough cluster on a shelf of rock overlooking the valley. The walls were old, rebuilt and repaired many times, and they divided the shelf into a series of small rooms open to the sky. Inside each room, the ground had been leveled and covered with packed earth or flat stones, forming sleeping platforms just wide enough for a man to lie stretched out. There were fire circles blackened from years of use, and flat rocks that served as tables or seats, and in one corner a low-walled enclosure where the crew's provisions were stored, the dried fish and bread and beer that the women sent up from the village, delivered by runners who made the climb each day. The men filed in and found their places with the practiced ease of long habit. Each man knew which room was his. The arrangements had been set long before Panahesi was born, based on seniority and the two sides of the gang, and they changed only when a man retired or died and someone new took his place. The senior draftsmen and painters had the rooms with the best shelter from the wind. The stonecutters and plasterers were grouped together nearer the provision store. The apprentices slept wherever there was space. Hay showed Panahesi to a room near the eastern edge of the camp, where a low wall offered some shelter, and the sleeping platform was covered with a coarse linen mat that had been left behind by whoever had slept there before. It was a plain spot, unremarkable, but when Panahesi set down his bundle and straightened up, he saw the view, and for a moment he forgot everything else. The camp looked out over the Theban landscape in every direction. To the east, the green valley and the river and the distant temples of Karnak, their obelisks catching the first sun. To the south, the great mortuary temples spread along the desert's edge like a procession of stone giants. To the west, the barren hills rolling away into the desert, and below, in the cleft of the valley to the north, the hidden entrances to the tombs of kings. He had grown up in sight of these hills, had played on the lower slopes as a child, had watched his father leave for the mountain every 10 days for as long as he could remember, but he had never been here, at the top, where the whole world lay open and the silence was so complete that he could hear his own pulse in his ears. Hay was beside him, unwrapping his tools, arranging his copper chisels in the careful order that every stonecutter maintained. He glanced at Panahesi and seemed to understand what the boy was feeling because he let the silence hold for a moment before he spoke. He told Panahesi that the view was the best part of the camp, and that the stone beds were the worst, and that after a few nights his back would stop hurting, and after a few more he would sleep better here than he did at home, because the stars were closer and the wind came off the desert at night with a coolness that the village, sheltered in its valley, never felt. He said this in the easy, matter-of-fact way that was his manner with most things. Hay, who could make a hard truth sound like a comfortable observation, who could fill a silence without crowding it. In the camp that first morning, While the men arranged their things and the fire was built and the morning rations distributed, Panahisi watched and listened and tried to understand the shape of this new life. The foreman spoke with the scribe, a thin, precise man named Userhat, who kept the daily records on ostraca and tracked the attendance of every man in the gang. The deputy distributed the day's supplies: lamp wicks, pigment cakes wrapped in linen, the copper tools signed out from the guardian of the storehouse. Each tool was accounted for. Each chisel and hoe was inspected before it was issued and inspected again when it was returned. A blunted chisel was exchanged for a sharpened one, and the guardian noted it on his tally. Nebnifer stood apart from the bustle, his own tools already prepared, talking quietly with another draughtsman, a man named Ipui, who worked the right side of the tomb. They spoke with the shorthand of colleagues who shared an understanding that required few words. The state of the plaster in the second corridor, the section of wall where the limestone had proved soft and needed additional preparation, the scribe's instructions for the next sequence of scenes. Panahesi watched his father and saw a man he recognized and did not recognize, the same face, the same hands, but held differently here, carried with a quiet authority that had nothing to do with the domestic world of the house below. The sun was fully up now, and the camp was bright and hard-edged in the desert light. The foreman gave the word. The men gathered their tools and began the short walk down into the valley toward the entrance of the royal tomb. And Panahisi, his heart beating in his throat, followed them into the mountain. The entrance to the tomb was cut into the valley wall at the base of a limestone cliff, a rectangular opening, modest from the outside, framed by the rough, pale stone of the hillside. It did not announce itself. There was no grand facade, no towering gateway. The royal tombs were hidden by design, set into the folds of the valley where they would be difficult for outsiders to find, and the entrance to this one, the tomb of the living pharaoh Rameses, second of that name, lord of the two lands, master of an empire that stretched from Nubia to the Euphrates, looked from a distance like nothing more than a shadow in the rock. But inside, the shadow opened into something vast. The corridor descended at a steady angle, cut deep into the bedrock, and the ceiling rose as the floor dropped until the passageway was tall enough for two men to walk abreast without stooping. The walls on either side had been smoothed and plastered, the first stage of the work, and in the sections nearest the entrance, where the draftsmen and painters had already finished, the plaster was covered with images so vivid and so precisely rendered that they seemed, in the lamplight, to breathe. Panahesi had seen tomb paintings before. Everyone in the village had. The artisans decorated their own burial chapels with scenes drawn from the same tradition, and the family tombs on the hillside above the village were among the most beautiful on the west bank. But the scale of the royal tomb was something else entirely. The corridors stretched deeper and deeper into the mountain, room opening into room, each one larger than the last, and the painted figures on the walls were taller than a man, gods and goddesses, their skin the colors of the earth and sky, their eyes outlined in black, their bodies composed with a perfection that made them seem not painted, but revealed, as though they had been waiting inside the stone all along, and the artists had simply uncovered them. The crew moved through the finished sections quickly, their oil lamps casting warm, steady light across the painted surfaces. The lamps were carefully made, shallow ceramic dishes filled with sesame oil or animal fat, with wicks of twisted linen that burned clean and bright without producing the dark smoke that would have stained the ceilings and walls. In some sections, polished copper mirrors had been placed at intervals to catch and redirect the lamplight, multiplying a single flame into a constellation of reflections that filled a chamber with a gentle, even glow. The painters needed good light to judge their colors, and the engineering of that light, its placement, its steadiness, its quality, was as much a part of the craft as the painting itself. They passed through a pillared hall where the ceiling was painted with golden stars on a field of deep blue, the body of the sky goddess Nut arching overhead, swallowing the sun at dusk and giving birth to it again at dawn. They passed chambers where the great serpent Apophis was shown being defeated by the sun god Ra in his nightly journey through the underworld, the eternal battle that ensured the sun would rise each morning, the cosmic machinery that kept the world in order. They passed images of the pharaoh himself, young, idealized, standing before the gods with the confidence of a man who expected to live among them. And then they reached the working face, where the finished sections ended and the raw stone began. Here the tomb was still becoming itself. The corridor opened into a wide chamber where the plasterers were at work, applying a thin coat of gypsum and lime to the smoothed rock walls, building up the surface in careful layers that would dry to a pale, even white, the ground on which the draughtsmen would draw and the painters would paint. In the adjoining passage, stonecutters were still cutting, the rhythmic ring of copper chisels on limestone echoing down the corridor, muffled by distance and by the close, still air. The rock dust hung in the lamplight like a fine golden haze. Panahesi was directed to the pigment station, a flat area near the working face where the materials of the painter's craft were laid out on linen cloths. There were lumps of red and yellow ochre dug from the desert and cakes of compressed carbon black and chunks of green malachite, rough and dull until they were ground fine and mixed with water and gum, at which point they became the vivid green of papyrus and new growth. There was the precious blue HSBD irit, Egyptian blue, a manufactured pigment made by heating together sand, copper, lime, and natron in a kiln, until the mixture fused into a glassy blue mass that was then ground to powder. It was the most valuable pigment they used, and the guardian of the storehouse tracked every grain of it. There were reed brushes in several sizes, some as fine as a single straw, others thick enough to cover broad areas with a single stroke. There were clay shells and stone pallets for mixing. There were pots of gum arabic, the binder that held the pigment together and made it adhere to the plaster. This was Panahesi's domain, at least for now. He had been trained in pigment preparation since boyhood. His mother had taught him to grind ochre for household paint before he was old enough to help with the bread. And in the weeks before the work week began, Nebnefer had made sure his son knew every mineral by sight and by feel, knew how fine to grind each one, knew how much binder to add, knew which pigments dried quickly and which ones stayed wet longer, knew the way that lamplight changed the appearance of certain colors so that a blue that looked perfect underground might look too dark or too green in daylight. But knowing was one thing, and doing was another, and Panahesi set to work with the careful, slightly too deliberate movements of a young man determined not to make a mistake. He ground the red ochre first, working the mineral against a smooth stone mortar with a round, grinding stone, pressing and turning until the coarse red lumps became a fine, silky powder that he swept into a clay shell. He added water a little at a time, and then the gum, stirring with a thin stick until the mixture reached the consistency that the painters required, fluid enough to flow smoothly from the brush, thick enough to hold its color without running. He prepared the black next, and then the yellow, and by the time he had finished all three, the senior painter had come to inspect his work. The painter, a calm, slow-moving man named Amenhotep, who had been filling in color behind Nebnefer's outlines for 20 years, tested each mixture with a brush on a flake of scrap limestone, studying the color in the lamplight, checking the consistency. He adjusted the black, a little more gum, and nodded at the rest. Panahasi exhaled. He had not realized he had been holding his breath. From where he sat at the pigment station, Panahasi could see his father working. Nebnefer stood before a section of freshly plastered wall at the boundary between the finished and unfinished portions of the tomb. The scribe Userhat had been here earlier, laying out the grid in thin red lines, a framework of horizontal and vertical guides that divided the wall into proportional units, ensuring that every figure would be drawn to the correct scale and in the correct relationship to the figures around it. The grid was the skeleton of the composition. The draftsman's job was to give it flesh. Nebnefer worked with a reed brush loaded with red ochre, drawing directly onto the white plaster. He began with the largest figure in the scene, a god, or perhaps the pharaoh in his divine aspect, starting with the crown and working downward. The proportions were prescribed by centuries of tradition. 18 squares from the soles of the feet to the hairline, the shoulders at a specific width, the waist at a specific point, the striding leg extended at a precise angle. Nebnefer knew these proportions so deeply that the grid was almost unnecessary to him, but he followed it nonetheless, because the grid was part of the discipline, part of the order, part of the system that ensured that what was painted in this tomb would look like what had been painted in tombs for 1,000 years before, and would be painted in tombs for 1,000 years to come. The red ochre lines were the first draft, loose, searching, feeling out the forms. When Nebnefer was satisfied with a section, he would return to it with a finer brush loaded with black paint, firming the outlines, correcting the proportions, sharpening the curves and angles until the figure stood on the wall with the authority of something that had always been there. The painters would follow these black lines exactly, filling in the flat fields of color that gave the figures their life, the red-brown of skin, the white of linen, the blue of lapis lazuli, the green of the marshlands, the gold of the divine. Panahasi watched. He had seen his father draw many times, on ostraca at home, on the walls of neighbors' tombs during rest days, on practice pieces brought back from the mountain. But he had never seen him draw like this. The scale was different. The intention was different. At home, drawing was a skill, a craft, something done with care and competence. Here, in the lamplight, 80 paces underground, with the weight of the mountain above and the silence pressing in from every side, it was something else. Nebnefer's hand moved with a certainty that seemed to come not from thought, but from some deeper place, from the hand itself, from the accumulated knowledge of 30 years, from the tradition that flowed through him like water through a channel cut in stone. The god took shape on the wall, The broad shoulders, the striding legs, the elaborate crown, the face in perfect profile, the eye rendered full frontal, the convention that allowed the painted figure to see into eternity. Nebnepher drew the arm extended, holding the ankh, the sign of life, and the was scepter, the sign of power, and beneath the figure he left space for the columns of hieroglyphs that the scribe would inscribe and the painters would fill with color. The work was slow, deliberate, and nearly silent. The only sounds were the soft scrape of the brush on plaster, the distant ringing of the stonecutters' chisels deeper in the mountain, and the occasional murmur of the painters consulting about a color. The air was cool and still and carried the faint, chalky smell of drying plaster and the sharper mineral scent of ground pigment. The lamps burned steadily, their small flames reflected in the polished copper mirrors, and in their light the painted figures on the finished walls seemed to watch the living men at work among them, gods and goddesses, looking on with their eternal, unblinking eyes as the same scenes were drawn again, one corridor deeper into the mountain, one step further into the dark. Panahesi would later find it difficult to describe what the tomb felt like to someone who had never been inside one. The silence was part of it, not the absence of sound exactly, but a quality of stillness that felt physical, like a pressure against the skin. The darkness was part of it too, the knowledge that beyond the small circle of lamplight, the corridors extended into a blackness so complete that it was indistinguishable from stone. And there was something else, harder to name, a sense of purpose so absolute that it permeated everything: the air, the walls, the movements of the men, the slow accumulation of color on plaster. This place was being built to hold a man's soul for eternity. Every line Nebnepher drew, every pigment Panahesi ground, every chisel stroke echoing from the deeper chambers was part of a single, vast intention: to defeat death, not to deny it, but to provide the dead king with everything he would need to pass through the underworld and emerge, reborn, into the light of an everlasting morning. This was what the men of Deir el-Medina did with their lives. And now Panahesi was among them, grinding ochre in the lamplight, watching his father's hand move across the wall, feeling the mountain above him and the silence around him, and the strange, solemn weight of work that mattered more than anything he had ever done. The first shift lasted 4 hours. When the foreman called the break, the men set down their tools and moved back toward the entrance, blinking in the late morning light like men emerging from a dream. Panahesi followed them out, and the sun hit his face, and the world, the valley, the sky, the distant green, seemed impossibly bright and loud and alive after the stillness of the tomb. Hay was beside him, squinting, stretching his arms above his head. He looked at Panahesi and grinned the broad, uncomplicated grin of a man who had been swinging a chisel for 3 hours and was ready for bread and beer. They walked back up to the camp together, and the morning shift was over, and the afternoon shift would begin after the midday rest, and the rhythm of the work, the ancient, steady, unhurried rhythm that had governed this place for generations, carried them forward like a current in a river that had been flowing long before they were born and would continue long after they were gone. The days found their shape. Pere settled over the Theban hills like a long, quiet breath, and with it came the steady rhythm of the work. 8 days on the mountain, 2 days at home, 8 days on the mountain again. a pattern so regular and so deeply established that the village and the camp and the path between them seemed less like separate places than like different rooms in the same house, connected by a corridor of stone and sky. Let us move through those early weeks the way the men themselves experienced them, not as a sequence of remarkable events, but as the gradual accumulation of ordinary ones, each day building on the last the way a painter builds up color on a wall, layer by layer, until the image emerges not all at once, but slowly, the way a face becomes familiar. In the tomb, Panahesi learned the work with his hands. The grinding of pigments, which had seemed straightforward enough at home, revealed itself underground as something more demanding than he had expected. Each mineral had its own character. Red ochre ground easily and forgave a rough hand, but yellow ochre was finer grained and required patience. Too much pressure and it clumped. Too little and the powder stayed coarse and the paint would be grainy on the wall. Malachite was hard and stubborn, a deep green stone that resisted the grinding stone and released its color reluctantly, grain by grain, and the powder had to be washed several times in water to remove impurities before it could be mixed with binder. Carbon black was simple, soot collected from lamps or charcoal ground fine. But even this required attention, because the consistency of black paint mattered more than most people realized. Too thick and the outlines would be clumsy. Too thin and they would bleed into the plaster. And then there was the blue, Egyptian blue, the color of the sky, of water, of the headdress of Amun, of the body of the sky goddess Nut, was not a mineral at all, but a manufactured substance, produced in kilns far from the village by heating sand, copper, lime, and natron together until they fused into a hard, glassy cake of the most vivid blue Panahesi had ever seen. The cakes arrived at the village wrapped in linen and were stored under the guardian's watch, and when a draughtsman or painter needed blue, it was issued in measured amounts and noted on the tally. Grinding it was delicate work. The cake was hard but brittle, and the trick was to crush it first into small pieces with a stone pestle, then grind the pieces slowly and evenly until the powder was as fine as river silt. If the grinding was too aggressive, the color lost its vibrancy. If it was too coarse, the paint would not spread evenly. The senior painter, Amenhotep, had shown Panahesi the technique on his first day and had watched him practice it 3 more times before he was satisfied. By the second week, Panahesi could prepare a full palette of colors: red, yellow, black, green, blue, and white, in the time it took the plasterers to finish a new section of wall. By the third week, the painters had stopped inspecting his mixtures before using them. This was not a compliment anyone spoke aloud. It was simply the absence of correction, and Panahesi understood it for what it was. He began to understand other things, too, the way the crew worked together, not as a group of individuals performing separate tasks, but as a single organism, each part dependent on the others. The stonecutters opened the way. The plasterers prepared the surface. The scribe laid the grid. The draughtsmen drew the outlines. The painters filled the color. The sculptors, when relief carving was required, cut the figures into the wall between the outline and the painting stages so that the images stood out from the surface in shallow relief. Each stage had to be completed before the next could begin, and each man's work was visible to every man who came after him. A poorly smoothed wall made the draughtsman's job harder. A careless outline made the painter's impossible. The work was a chain, and every link bore the weight of the links that followed. Panahesi noticed that his father never rushed. Other draftsmen, competent men, respected men, sometimes worked with a brisk efficiency that got the job done and moved on. Nebnefer did not. He stood before each new section of wall as though meeting it for the first time, studying the plaster, feeling its texture with his fingertips, noting where the surface was slightly uneven or where the grid lines had been drawn at a marginal angle. Only when he was satisfied with his understanding of the wall did he pick up the brush, and when he drew, his pace was steady and unhurried, the brush moving in long, fluid strokes that seemed to arrive at their destination without hesitation, as though the line had been waiting in the plaster and Nebnefer's hand was simply following where it led. The other men noticed it too, though they would not have described it the way Panahesi experienced it. To them, Nebnefer was simply very good at what he did, one of the best draftsmen the village had produced in a generation, a man whose outlines were so clean and so assured that the painters trusted them completely, never needing to adjust or compensate. They respected him for this the way craftsmen everywhere respect the person among them who makes the difficult look effortless. It was a respect earned through decades of consistent, quiet excellence, and it gave Nebnefer a standing in the crew that had nothing to do with his rank. In the camp at night, the men became themselves again. The professional distances collapsed. The foreman played senate with the stonecutters. The scribe told jokes. The painters argued amiably about the best way to render the scales on a serpent. Hay, who seemed incapable of silence for more than a few minutes at a stretch, told stories, long, rambling, good-natured tales about a fisherman he knew on the river who had once caught a catfish so large that it pulled his boat upstream for half a day, or about a man in the village who had dreamed that Ptah appeared to him and told him to build a new shrine, and when he woke up, he discovered that his neighbor's goat had eaten the offering bread he'd left out the night before, which the wise woman Naunucht had interpreted as meaning that Ptah wanted the shrine built somewhere else. The man laughed. The fire burned low. The stars turned overhead. The mountain camp, for all its roughness, the stone beds, the wind, the scorpions that occasionally turned up in a man's sandal, had a quality that Panahesi had not expected. It felt like belonging. These men had worked together for years, some of them for decades. They knew each other's habits, each other's strengths, each other's small irritations. They had carried each other's tools when someone was sick. They had covered for each other when someone needed a day off for reasons that the scribe's official records described with bureaucratic delicacy as personal matters or brewing beer or, on one memorable occasion recorded years ago, arguing with his wife. They were not family, but they were something adjacent to family, a fellowship of shared labor that ran deeper than friendship and required less explanation. Panahesi found his place in this fellowship gradually, the way water finds its level. In the first week he had been an outsider, the new boy, the youngest, the son of the senior draftsman, watched to see whether he would be any good or whether his acceptance into the gang had been merely the expected inheritance of his father's position. By the third week he was part of the furniture. He knew who snored. He knew who woke first. He knew that Hay liked his beer warm, and that the plasterer named Kenna preferred to eat alone, and that the foreman's deputy, a taciturn man named Penrennet, played the flute in the evenings with a sweetness that seemed impossible from someone so stern. And in the evenings, when the work was done and the camp settled into its nighttime quiet, Panahesi sketched. He had brought ostraca with him, smooth flakes of limestone, flat and pale, the same material the scribe used for his daily records. In the firelight, with a reed brush and a shell of ink, Panahesi practiced. He drew the canonical figures, gods in profile, pharaohs striding, the symmetrical patterns of the decorative borders. He copied what he had seen his father draw that day, trying to reproduce the proportions from memory, checking his work against the mental image and finding always that something was slightly off. The shoulder too narrow, the leg too short, the curve of the crown not quite right. But sometimes, when he had finished his practice and the brush was still in his hand and the ostracon was still before him, he drew something else. A lizard he had seen on the path that morning, frozen on a warm rock with its throat pulsing. The shape of the mountain against the stars. The face of the old painter Amenhotep as he squinted at a color in the lamplight, one eye closed, his head tilted. Small things, living things, things that did not belong in a tomb and had no place in the traditional repertoire, but that his hand seemed to want to draw anyway, as though the brush had its own intentions. He kept these sketches separate from his practice work, tucking them into his bundle where no one would see them. He was not ashamed of them exactly, but he was not sure what they were, or what they meant, or whether the impulse that produced them was a sign of something valuable, or merely a distraction from the real work of learning the craft. Nebnepher saw one of them. Panahesi did not know when or how. Perhaps one had slipped from his bundle, or perhaps his father had simply noticed and looked when his son was occupied elsewhere. But one evening, as the camp was settling down and the fire was dying to embers, Nebnepher sat down beside Panahesi and held out a flake of limestone on which Panahesi had drawn a hoopoe bird, the crested, striped bird that was common on the hillsides around the village, with its curved beak and its habit of fanning its crown when startled. It was a quick sketch, done in a few strokes, and it was not technically accomplished in the way that the canonical work demanded. The proportions were not governed by any grid. The pose was not one of the standard positions. It was simply a bird, seen and drawn, alive on the stone in a way that the figures in the tomb, for all their magnificence, were not. Nebnepher looked at it for a long time. Panahesi watched his father's face and could not read what he found there. Finally, Nebnepher said that the beak was good, the curve was right. He handed the ostracon back and stood up and went to his sleeping place without another word. It was not much. It was not praise exactly, or instruction, or even acknowledgement of the kind that Panahesi had hoped for. But in the days that followed, he noticed that his father sometimes paused at the pigment station a moment longer than necessary, glancing at whatever ostracon Panahesi had left beside his grinding stone, the evening's practice or the morning's observation, and then moved on without comment, as though the looking were enough. The family tomb waited. On rest days, when the men came down from the mountain and the village filled again with their presence, their voices, their appetites, their particular way of taking up space after 8 days of absence, Nebnepher returned to the hillside. He rose early, as he always did, gathered his tools and pigments in the linen bundle, and climbed the rough-cut steps to the small chapel above the village where his life's most personal work was slowly taking shape. By mid-season, the fields of Yaru had begun to emerge on the western wall, He had sketched the full composition in the first weeks of Paris, working out the arrangement of figures and landscape in red ochre outlines that covered the wall like a map of a place that existed only in faith and tradition. The fields of Yaru, the paradise of the blessed dead, were among the most beloved scenes in the Egyptian funerary repertoire, and nearly every tomb chapel on the hillside included some version of them. But no two were exactly alike, because the fields were understood to be personal. Each person's eternity was shaped by the life they had lived, and the painter of a family tomb was free to choose the details that mattered most. Nebnefer had chosen carefully. The fields stretched across the wall in horizontal registers, divided by channels of bright blue water, the canals of paradise, fed by an eternal Nile. In the topmost register, the grain grew impossibly tall, golden stalks reaching above the heads of the figures who harvested it with bronze sickles, their movements graceful and unhurried, their faces turned slightly toward the viewer with expressions of calm pleasure. This was the afterlife at its most hopeful, abundance without labor, harvest without effort, the earth yielding its gifts freely and without end. In the middle register, Nebnefer had painted himself. He stood in the traditional pose, 1 foot forward, shoulders broad, wearing the white linen kilt of a working man. But beside him he had placed Merit, her hand touching his arm, her dress the fine pleated linen of a woman of standing, her hair dressed in the style she favored for festivals. Their names were inscribed before them in careful hieroglyphs, and around them, smaller but no less carefully rendered, were their children. He painted them all. The eldest son, Kayamwea, who had married and moved to a house at the far end of the village, where he worked as a carpenter in the gang. The daughter, Takat, who had married a painter from the right side of the crew and now lived 3 doors down from her parents, close enough that Merit could hear her grandchild crying at night through the thin mud-brick walls. And between them, slightly smaller, rendered with a tenderness that showed in the particular care of the brushwork, a child, a small boy, barely more than an infant, depicted in the standard pose of a child in Egyptian art, a finger raised to the lips, the side lock of youth falling across one shoulder. His name, inscribed in a neat column beside him, was Amos. Amos had died in his 2nd year. It had been a long time ago, more than 20 years, and the cause had been the kind of fever that passed through the village every few seasons, taking the weakest with it, the very old and the very young. Nebnefer and Merit did not speak of it often. It was not a wound that required tending, not any more. It had healed in the way that such wounds do, not by disappearing, but by becoming part of the landscape of a life, a valley that the path of years passed through and moved beyond but never forgot. But here, on the wall of the family tomb, Amos was present. He stood among his siblings in the fields of Yaru, and in the logic of the painted afterlife, he would be there when they arrived, waiting for them in the golden grain, whole and well, restored to the family that death had not, in the end, been able to divide. Merit came up to the tomb most rest days, usually in the late morning when the bread was baked and the household was settled. She brought food and beer and sat on the flat stone outside the chapel entrance while Nebnefer worked, and they talked the way they always talked, in fragments, in half-sentences, in the comfortable ellipses of people who have been finishing each other's thoughts for 30 years. She told him about the village. He told her about the tomb, the royal one, the scenes coming together in the second corridor, the quality of the plaster in the new chamber. She asked about Panahisi. He said the boy was doing well. He ground his pigments properly and kept his station organized and had not yet dropped a lamp or spilled a pot of blue, which Nebnefer said put him ahead of most apprentices in their first season. Merritt heard what he said and also what he did not say, that Nebnefer was watching their son more closely than he let on, and that what he saw pleased him in ways he was not yet ready to put into words. She asked about the wall. She always asked about the wall. The family tomb was as much hers as his, more in some respects because her share of the family's property was protected by law, and the tomb was part of the marital estate that would belong to her in the event of his death. But her interest was not legal, it was personal, and it was precise. She wanted to know where the sycamore tree would go, the one she had asked for, with nut reaching from its branches to offer sustenance to the dead. She wanted to know whether he had left room above the main scene for the vulture of Nekbet, wings spread in protection. She wanted to see the colors. She had opinions about the colors. Nebnefer listened to all of it with the patient attentiveness of a man who had learned over many years that Merritt's opinions were worth hearing, not because she was a painter, but because she saw things he did not. She understood the emotional weight of an image in a way that was different from his technical understanding. When she said the green of the field should be darker, closer to the color of new barley than to the pale green of papyrus, she was not thinking about pigment ratios. She was thinking about what the scene should feel like, how it should make a person feel to stand in this small room, lit by a single lamp, surrounded by these walls, knowing that the bodies of their family lay in the chambers below. She wanted the fields to feel like abundance, like arrival, like home. He adjusted the green. On a rest day in the 5th or 6th week of Pare, the exact date is lost to us, as so many things are, though the season itself remains. Panahisi came up the hillside path to the family tomb. He had not been asked. Nebnefer had not invited him, and Merritt had not suggested it, though she had perhaps mentioned in the way that mothers mention things, that his father was working on the western wall, and that the fields of Yaru were coming along beautifully, and that it might be nice for him to see them. Panahisi had taken this information in with the non-committal acknowledgement of a 17-year-old and had then, the following morning, climbed the hill. He found his father standing before the wall with a brush in his hand and a look on his face that Panahisi recognized from the tomb, the particular inward focus that meant Nebnefer was not fully present in the room, that some part of him had gone into the wall and was working from a place that could not be reached by conversation. Panahisi sat on the stone bench near the entrance and waited. The chapel was small, perhaps 3 paces wide and 4 deep, with a vaulted ceiling that curved overhead like the inside of a bread oven. The walls were warm in the morning light, the plaster smooth and pale where it had not yet been painted, vivid with color where it had. The western wall, which faced Panahisi as he sat, was the one Nebnefer had been working on all season, and he could see now, for the first time, the full scope of what his father was making. It was beautiful. He had expected it to be competent. His father was the best draftsman in the village, and competence was the least of what he could produce. But the beauty of it surprised him. The fields of Yaru glowed on the wall in golds and greens, and the deep, rich blue of the canals, and the figures of his parents stood at the center of the scene with a dignity and a tenderness that Panahesi had not seen in his father's work before. In the royal tomb, Nebnifer's outlines were precise, authoritative, technically flawless, the work of a master craftsman executing a commission. Here, the lines had a different quality. They were softer, more personal. The figure of Merit was not a standardized woman rendered in the canonical proportions, but a specific person, his mother, recognizable in the set of her shoulders and the particular way she held her hand against Nebnefer's arm. And there, among the children, Panahesi saw the small figure, the boy with the side lock, the finger to the lips. He knew the name without reading the inscription. Ahmose, the brother he had never known, who had died years before Panahesi was born, whose name was spoken in the house only at certain times, when Merit left offerings at the household shrine on certain days, when the family visited the cemetery during festivals, when his parents' voices dropped into the particular quiet that Panahesi had learned as a child to recognize as the sound of something being remembered. He looked at the small painted figure for a long time. Ahmose stood in the eternal fields beside his siblings, whole and present, part of the family that would be reunited in the afterlife. Panahesi understood, sitting there in the chapel with the morning light slanting through the door, that this was what the tomb was for, not for death, for continuation, for the promise that what was loved would not be lost. He did not say any of this to his father. He sat quietly and watched Nebnefer work, and after a while he reached into his bundle and brought out an ostrakhan. It was a sketch he had made in the camp, one of the pieces he kept separate from his practice work, the ones drawn from observation rather than from tradition. This one was different from the others. It was not a bird or a lizard or a face glimpsed by firelight. It was the view from the mountain camp at dawn, the Theban plain stretching out below, the temples along the desert's edge, the green fields beyond, and the river curving away into the distance. He had drawn it in quick, loose strokes, trying to capture not the details but the feeling of it, the immensity, the light, the sense of standing at the top of the world and seeing everything laid out below like a gift. He held it out to his father. Nebnefer set down his brush and took the ostrakhan and held it at arm's length, the way he held things when he wanted to see them whole rather than in their parts. He studied it. The composition was unconventional. There were no figures, no gods, no standard elements of the funerary repertoire. It was simply a landscape rendered with an economy of line that showed real instinct for the essential shape of things. The river was a single curving stroke. The temples were suggested rather than depicted, a few vertical lines and a shadow. The fields were a wash of green applied with a broad brush. It should not have worked. The traditional art of Egypt did not deal in landscapes for their own sake, did not render vistas or atmospheric effects, did not concern itself with the way the light fell on a particular morning from a particular vantage point. The tradition dealt in eternal forms, the unchanging images of gods and pharaohs and the blessed dead, arranged according to principles that had been refined over centuries into a visual language as precise and as legible as the hieroglyphs themselves. And yet, the ostrakhan in Nebnefer's hand had something. It was not technically refined, and it would never appear on the wall of a tomb, but it was alive in a way that the canonical figures, for all their perfection, were not. It showed a way of seeing that was Panahesi's own, not inherited, not taught, but discovered through the act of looking at the world and putting down what he saw. Nebnifer held the ostracon for a long time. What moved through him in that silence was not a single thing, but several things at once, layered and braided together the way the colors in a painting are layered on the wall. He saw his son's talent, not the talent he had hoped to pass on, not the mastery of the grid and the canonical forms, but a different kind of talent, one that he had not anticipated and did not entirely understand. He saw that Panahesi would be a good draftsman, perhaps even a very good one in the traditional sense, because the boy had the hands and the eye and the discipline. But he also saw that Panahesi's eye was not his eye. The son saw things the father did not. And this was the thing that Nebnifer sat with in the silence of the chapel, turning it over the way a man turns a stone in his hand, was both a gift and a kind of departure. He handed the ostracon back. He said that the river was good. The curve of it was right. It was the same thing he had said about the hoopoe's beak in the mountain camp weeks before. It was not much. It was not the kind of praise that a young man hopes to hear from his father. But Panahesi heard something in it that he had not heard the first time, a recognition, careful and quiet, of something that Nebnifer was still finding words for. Merit arrived not long after, carrying bread and beer and a small basket of dried figs from the stores. She climbed the path and found them both in the chapel, Nebnifer at his wall, Panahesi on the bench with the ostracon in his lap. And she looked at the wall, and then at her husband, and then at her son, and she felt the presence of something that had shifted between them, though she could not have said exactly what it was. She set the food down and went to look at the fields of Yaru. The sycamore tree was there. Nut leaned from its branches, her arms extended, offering bread and water to the figures below. The green was dark, the color of new barley, just as Merit had wanted. She looked at it for a long time, and then she turned to Nebnifer and told him that the tree was right, that it was exactly right. They sat together in the chapel doorway, the three of them, father and mother and son, and ate the bread and drank the beer, and the morning light came through the door and fell across the painted wall, and the small figure of Ahmoz stood among his family in the eternal fields, and the hillside was quiet except for the sound of a hoopoe calling from the rocks below. Let us stay in the village now, but at a different hour and in a different key, the hours when the men were gone, when the narrow street belonged to the women and children and to the rhythms of a life that the tomb workers, for all their skill, could not have sustained without. During the 8-day work weeks of Pere, when the men of the gang climbed the mountain path before dawn and did not return until the cycle ended, the village became a different place. Not emptier exactly. There were still the older men who had retired from the crew, and the boys too young to work, and the guardians and doorkeepers who came and went. But the center of gravity shifted. The women who had spent the rest days in the supporting rhythms of their husbands' presence stepped forward into the full breadth of their own authority, and the village ran on their labor and their judgment as surely as the tomb ran on the draftsman's lines. Merit's days had a structure as fixed and as purposeful as the work shifts underground. She rose before dawn, not because anyone required it, but because the bread would not bake itself, and the grain would not grind itself, and the beer would not brew itself. And all of these things needed to happen in the right order and at the right time, and if they did not, the household would falter in ways both small and significant. The servant women assigned to the family, Bakatmut and a younger woman named Hunero, were already at the grinding stones in the back room when Merritt came through, checking the grain stores in the cellar, calculating how much remained and how much would be needed before the next ration distribution. The grain was the foundation of everything. The men of the gang were paid in emmer wheat and barley, measured in kar, the standard unit, and delivered at regular intervals by the administration of the tomb. From this grain came the bread that fed the family, and the beer that quenched their thirst, and the surplus that could be bartered in the informal economy of the village for everything else a household needed: linen cloth, sandals, pottery, cosmetics, firewood, dried fish, the occasional luxury of honey or good oil. Merritt managed this economy with an attention to detail that would have impressed the scribe Userhat himself. She knew the current exchange rate for a jar of beer, knew which neighbors had linen to spare and which ones were short on grain, knew the cost of a pair of sandals from the leather worker who lived just outside the walls. She kept no written accounts, though she could read, as many women in the village could, thanks to the unusual literacy of the community. But her memory for transactions was exact, and no one in the household went without. The bread was baked in the domed clay oven in the kitchen at the back of the house. The oven radiated heat into the mud brick walls, and on cold Paray mornings the kitchen was the warmest room, and Merritt sometimes lingered there after the loaves were in, standing near the oven's mouth with her hands wrapped around a cup of warm beer, watching the light change in the small high window. These were quiet moments, private ones, and they belonged to her in the way that Nebnifer's early mornings at the family tomb belonged to him. Small pockets of solitude in a life that was otherwise densely shared. The brewing was another matter. Beer in the village was not a luxury but a staple, a thick, nourishing drink made from partially baked bread that was crumbled into water and left to ferment in large ceramic vats. The process took several days, and the mistress of the house supervised it personally because the quality of the beer reflected directly on the household, and because the monitoring of the fermentation was, according to the village's administrative records, a legitimate reason for a man to take a day off work. Merritt brewed twice a month, producing enough to supply the family and to have a surplus for barter, and she took a craftsman's pride in the result, a beer that was smooth and sweet, with a tang that the neighbors appreciated, and that Nebnifer, who was not given to extravagant compliments, described as the best in the street. The street itself was alive during the work weeks in a way that it was not when the men were home. The women gathered at doorways, at the cistern, at the small open area near the north gate where the goods from the support workers were received and distributed. They talked. The conversation of the village women was not idle. It was the medium through which information traveled. Disputes were aired, alliances were formed, reputations were made and adjusted. Who had received a larger grain ration than expected? Whose husband had been marked absent from the crew for the third time this season? Whose daughter was being courted by the deputy's son? Whose servant woman had been caught trading grain on her own account? The village was small and privacy was scarce, and the women who managed its households were as attuned to its social currents as any scribe was to the records on his ostraca. There were disputes, too, the kind of small, persistent disagreements that arise in any close community. A woman named Hel claimed that her neighbor Neferti had borrowed a garment, a fine linen shawl, and failed to return it. The matter had been simmering for weeks, passed back and forth in the conversations at the cistern, and it would eventually come before the village court, a body of foremen, deputies, and senior craftsmen who sat in judgment on civil disputes, and whose decisions were recorded by the scribe and enforced by the doorkeepers. Women could bring cases, testify, and represent themselves, and they did so regularly. The law at Deir el-Medina was not abstract. It was lived, and it was as much a part of the village's fabric as the bread and the beer. Merritt knew about the shawl. Everyone did. She had her own opinion. She thought Hel was in the right, based on what she had seen and heard. But she kept it to herself because the court would decide, and because taking sides in other people's disputes was a reliable way to create problems in your own household. She had learned this through long experience, the way she had learned most of the things she knew, not from instruction, but from observation, from living in a community where every action had consequences, and where the reputation of a household was a form of currency as real and as valuable as grain. It was during one of these midweek mornings, the 5th or 6th week of Pare, the sky a pale, cool blue, the sound of grinding stones and children's voices filling the street, that Merritt walked to the Hathor Chapel for the midweek rite. The chapel stood near the northern end of the village, a small mudbrick structure with a low door and a painted lintel. It was one of perhaps 16 or 18 shrines scattered in and around the village, dedicated to the various gods and goddesses the community honored. Ptah, the craftsman's god; Thoth and Seshat, patrons of writing; Taweret and Bez, protectors of mothers and children; Renenutet, the cobra goddess of the harvest; and Meretseger, she who loves silence, the mountain goddess who watched over the necropolis and the village alike. But the Hathor Chapel held a particular place in the women's devotion. Hathor was the goddess of love and music and motherhood and joy, and her worship was woven into the texture of women's lives at Deir el-Medina in ways that went far deeper than formal ritual. Merritt entered the chapel and took her place. She was not the only chantress. There were 3 others who served the chapel regularly, all wives of senior men, but she was the most experienced, and when she lifted the sistrum and shook it, the metallic rattle filled the small space with a sound that was both musical and strange, like the voice of the goddess herself speaking through the bronze. The other women sang. The hymn was familiar. Merritt knew it so well that the words seemed to rise from a place below thought, and in the close, incense-scented air of the chapel, with the painted image of Hathor looking out from the wall with her cow's ears and her gentle smile, the song became something more than sound. It became a kind of presence, a warmth that filled the room and held the women in it the way water holds the fish. Merritt prayed. She prayed for the household, for her children, for Nebnefer's steady hand, for Panahisi's safety in the tomb. She prayed for the family, the living and the dead, because in the theology of the village there was no sharp line between them. The dead were present. They could be spoken to, written to, asked for help and guidance. Letters to the dead were left at tombs and shrines, inscribed on pottery or limestone, asking a deceased parent for protection against illness or a departed spouse for intervention in a dispute. The dead were part of the community, as real and as consequential as the neighbors on either side. She did not pray for Amos, not in words, but when she placed the small offering at the base of Hathor's image, a round loaf of bread and a cup of beer, the staples of both this life and the next, she thought of him, briefly and completely, the way a person thinks of someone they have loved, not with the sharp grief of new loss, but with the steady, settled ache of an absence that has become a permanent feature of the heart. When the rite was finished and the other women had gone, Merritt lingered. She stepped outside the chapel and found Naunacht waiting on the low stone bench that sat against the chapel's outer wall, in the thin shade of a tamarisk that grew there in a crack between the stones. Naunacht was old, older than anyone in the village could say with certainty, though the best estimates placed her near 70, an impressive age in any era and a remarkable one in ancient Egypt. She had outlived 2 husbands, the second of whom had been a foreman of the right side of the gang, and this connection, combined with her age and her long memory and a quality of perception that the village recognized as something more than ordinary intelligence, had given her a standing in the community that no title could have conferred. She was the Raket, the wise woman, though the term was used loosely and covered a range of functions that overlapped and blurred. She interpreted dreams. She identified which deity might be responsible for an illness or a run of bad luck. She knew remedies, herbs, charms, prayers to specific gods, and she dispensed them with a practical authority that the village's physician did not always command. She was not a priestess, and she held no official position, but when a woman in the village had a question that could not be answered by the scribe's records or the foreman's judgment, a question about meaning, about the invisible forces that shaped a life, she came to Naunacht. Merritt sat down beside her. The 2 women had known each other for decades, since Merritt had come to the village as a young bride, nervous and uncertain, and Naunacht, already middle-aged and widowed for the first time, had shown her where to buy good linen and how to manage the servant women and which neighbors could be trusted and which ones talked too freely. The friendship between them was not showy. It expressed itself in proximity, in the comfortable silence of 2 people who did not need to perform their affection, in the way Merritt always brought an extra cup of beer when she visited the chapel, and Naunacht always accepted it without comment, as though the beer had simply appeared of its own accord. Merritt told Naunacht about a dream. She had dreamed, 2 nights ago during the work week, alone in the house with only the servant women and the sound of the mice in the cellar, that she was standing in the family tomb. The chapel was finished, the walls fully painted, and the lamps were lit, though she could not see who had lit them. She was looking at the western wall, at the fields of Yaru, and everything was as Nebnefer had painted it. The golden grain, the blue canals, the sycamore tree, except that in the dream the grain was moving, swaying in a wind she could not feel, and the water in the canals was flowing, and the small figure of Amos had turned his face toward her and was smiling. She had woken with the image still vivid behind her eyes, and had lain in the dark for a long time, not frightened but unsettled, feeling the dream's presence the way one feels the warmth of a fire that has just gone out. Naunacht listened. She listened the way she always listened, completely, without interruption, her eyes resting on Merritt's face with a calm attention that made the speaker feel that what she was saying mattered, that it was being received and weighed and taken seriously. When Merritt had finished, Naunacht was quiet for a moment. Then she said that the dream was from Amose. that the dead sometimes spoke through dreams, especially to their mothers, and that the smile and the movement in the fields meant that he was well, that he was where he should be in the place that Nebnefer was painting for him, and that the painting was right. The dream was not a warning or a demand. It was a reassurance, a message from a child to his mother, sent across the boundary that separated the living from the dead, carried on the current of sleep the way a letter might be carried on the river. Naunacht told Merit to leave a small offering at the family tomb, bread and beer, as she had left at the chapel, and perhaps a flower if one could be found, not as a ritual obligation, but as an answer. The child had spoken. The mother should reply. Merit nodded. The weight she had been carrying since the dream, not grief exactly, but the particular heaviness of an encounter with something that could not be fully understood, shifted and eased, not because Naunacht had explained it away, but because she had given it a shape. The dream was not a mystery to be solved. It was a conversation to be continued. They sat together for a few more minutes, drinking the beer, watching the morning light move across the chapel wall. A child ran past in the street, laughing. The sound of the grinding stones rose and fell. Somewhere outside the village walls, the sound of donkey hooves on the path meant that Amenemope was approaching with the day's water. He arrived a little later than usual, leading 2 donkeys loaded with clay jars, their sides dark with moisture. The cistern was low. It was always low by mid-morning, and the women who had gathered to draw water stepped back to let him pour. He worked with the unhurried efficiency of long practice, lifting each jar from the donkey's cradle and tipping it carefully into the basin, watching the water settle and clear. Naunacht, still sitting on the bench outside the chapel, watched him. She had known Amenemope for a long time, since before his reassignment, since the days when he had been a young stonecutter in the gang, and she had been the wife of the foreman of the right side. She remembered him. The village was small enough and her memory long enough that she remembered most people, including the ones who had left and come back in a different form. She raised a hand in greeting as he passed, and he returned it. A nod, a slight lifting of the chin, the particular acknowledgement of a man who understood that Naunacht's greeting carried more weight than most people's. He filled the cistern and gathered his donkeys and turned back toward the path. The women moved in to draw their water. The morning continued. The village breathed and worked and talked and ground its grain and baked its bread, and the men on the mountain were a distant thought, present in the calculations of the ration stores and in the quiet spaces of the bed at night, but otherwise subsumed into the larger rhythm of a community that did not pause when they left and did not start when they returned, but continued steadily, like the river that fed the green land, that grew the grain, that made the bread, that sustained the life, that made the work possible. The weeks of Pere accumulated like layers of paint on a wall, each one indistinguishable from the last in its basic composition, yet each one adding depth and substance to the whole, so that what had been a bare surface at the beginning of the season was now something rich and complex, a thing with weight and color and dimension. In the tomb, the work moved forward. The second corridor was nearly complete. The walls on both sides were covered in painted scenes, the pharaoh's journey through the 12 hours of the night, guided by the gods through a landscape of darkness and danger, through the coils of the serpent Apophis and the caverns where the damned cried out and the gates that opened only to those who knew the proper words. The colors were vivid in the lamplight, the deep blue of the sky goddess's body across the ceiling, the red-brown of the pharaoh's skin, the white of his linen, the green of the papyrus marshes through which the solar bark sailed toward the dawn. The painters had worked with slow, methodical care, filling in the flat fields of color within Nebnifer's outlines, building up the layers, base coat, then detail, then the fine black lines that defined the edges and gave each figure its final, sharp-edged clarity. The crew had begun work on the third corridor. This was newer, rougher. The stonecutters had only recently finished cutting it, and the plasterers were still at work on the far walls, smoothing the final coat of gypsum and lime. The air here was thicker, carrying the chalky dust of drying plaster and the sharp mineral smell of fresh-cut limestone, and the lamplight did not carry as far, so that the men worked in smaller pools of light surrounded by deeper shadow. It was in this corridor that the next sequence of scenes would be drawn, the Book of Gates, the ancient text that described the pharaoh's passage through the gates of the underworld, each one guarded by serpents and demons, each one requiring the knowledge of a name or a spell or a prayer to pass through safely. Nebnifer studied the wall. The plaster was good, smooth and even, well cured, ready for the grid. Userhat the scribe had already begun laying out the red guidelines, working from the master plan that specified the content and arrangement of each scene, and the first sections of the grid were dry and ready for the draughtsman's brush. But before Nebnifer began, he did something that Panahesi had not seen him do before. He stood in front of the blank wall for a long time, longer than usual, longer than seemed necessary for a man who had drawn these scenes 100 times, and he placed his hand flat against the plaster. He held it there for the space of several breaths, as though he were feeling for something. The temperature of the stone behind the plaster, the texture of the surface, something deeper that could only be perceived through the palm. Then he withdrew his hand and picked up his brush and began. Panahesi, watching from the pigment station, did not understand the gesture. He filed it away in the growing archive of things he had observed about his father's work that he could not yet explain. The pauses, the adjustments, the small private rituals that seemed to have no practical purpose, but that were clearly to Nebnifer essential. He would understand them later, perhaps, or perhaps he would not. Perhaps some things about the craft could only be transmitted through decades of practice, absorbed through the hands and the eyes until they became instinct, and no amount of watching could substitute for the slow accumulation of doing. But Panahesi was doing now too. His role had expanded. The senior painter Amenhotep, satisfied with Panahesi's pigment preparation, had begun to use him for other tasks, cleaning brushes, preparing the gesso wash that was sometimes applied over a finished section to seal and protect the paint, mixing the varnish that was used on certain surfaces to give them a warm amber glow. And then, one morning in the 7th or 8th week of Pere, Amenhotep had handed him a broad brush and pointed to a section of wall where the background color had been outlined but not yet filled in. It was a simple task. The background behind a row of hieroglyphs needed to be painted a flat, even yellow, a base coat that required no particular skill, only a steady hand and the patience to cover the area smoothly without leaving streaks or thin patches. Any competent apprentice could have done it. But Panahasi understood that this was not about the yellow. It was about being trusted with a brush on the wall of a royal tomb. He painted the yellow. He painted it slowly, carefully, keeping his strokes even and his hand steady, dipping the brush often so that the paint never ran dry and the color stayed consistent. The section was not large, perhaps the span of his outstretched arms, and it took him less than an hour. When he was finished, Amenhotep inspected it without comment, nodded once, and moved on. Panahasi cleaned the brush and returned to his station and felt the cool stone of the pigment table under his hands and the quiet, spreading warmth of something accomplished. After that, the tasks came more frequently. A border to fill, a background to complete, a second coat of white over a section where the base had dried unevenly. Small things, always and always under the painter's supervision, but each one a step further from the grinding stone and closer to the wall. Panahasi understood the pace. The craft did not hurry. A man did not grind pigments one week and draw the pharaoh's face the next. The progression from apprentice to painter to draftsman was measured in years, sometimes in decades, and at each stage the work expected more than skill. It expected understanding, the ability to see not just what was on the wall, but what the wall was for, what the images meant, what they did, how they functioned in the complex machinery of resurrection that the tomb was designed to set in motion. This understanding came to Panahasi slowly, in pieces, the way the tomb itself was revealed to him corridor by corridor. He learned that the scenes were not merely decorative, they were operative. Each image, each hieroglyph, each painted figure served a purpose in the pharaoh's journey from death to rebirth. The gods on the walls were not illustrations of a story. They were the story, made real through the act of painting, activated by the ritual words that would be spoken over them when the tomb was sealed. To paint a god was, in some sense, to summon one. To draw the solar bark sailing through the underworld was to ensure that the sun would rise. The artists of Deir el-Medina were not merely craftsmen. They were participants in the most essential act of their civilization, the maintenance of Ma'at, truth, balance, the proper order of the world, through the creation of images that held the cosmos together. Panahasi did not arrive at this understanding through instruction. No one sat him down and explained the theology of the tomb. It came through immersion, through the hours spent underground in the lamplight, surrounded by the painted gods, breathing the mineral air, feeling the weight of the mountain above. It came through watching his father draw, through the quiet authority of Nebnefer's hand on the wall, through the way the older men spoke of the work, not with reverence exactly, but with a seriousness that went deeper than pride. They knew what they were making. They knew what it meant, and this knowledge, transmitted not in words but in the quality of attention they brought to every line and every color, was the real apprenticeship, the one that could not be rushed and could not be measured and could not be recorded on any ostrakhan. One evening in the camp, deep into the season, Nebnefer did something unexpected. The work that day had gone well. The third corridor was taking shape, the first scenes of the Book of Gates emerging on the walls, the guardian serpents coiling around the doorways, the figures of the blessed dead passing through toward the light. The foreman was satisfied. The scribe's records showed the crew ahead of schedule. The mood in the camp was easy and warm, and Hay was telling a story about a man who had bet his neighbor that he could carry a full jar of water on his head from the cistern to the far end of the village street without spilling a drop, and had succeeded, only to discover that the jar had a crack in the bottom and had left a trail of water the entire way, which his wife had made him mop up with his own festival kilt. The men laughed, the fire crackled, the stars were very bright. When the laughter faded, Nebnifer moved to where Panahesi was sitting and sat down beside him. He had a fresh ostrakhan in his hand, a smooth, flat piece of limestone, larger than the usual practice flakes and very white. He set it on the ground between them, and then he set beside it a reed brush and a small shell of black ink. He told Panahesi to draw the gate. Panahesi looked at him. The gate was the central image of the Book of Gates, the great doorway of the underworld, flanked by its guardian serpents, surmounted by the figure of the god who judged the dead. It was a complex composition requiring precise proportions and a confident hand. It was not a task for an apprentice. Nebnifer said it again. Draw the gate, not for the wall, for the ostrakhan, for practice. He said that Panahesi had been watching long enough, and that the only way to learn whether the eye could guide the hand was to let the hand try. Panahesi picked up the brush. His hand was not steady. He dipped it in the ink and brought it to the stone and hesitated, the brush hovering a finger's width above the surface, and for a moment the whole weight of the tradition, the centuries of accumulated knowledge, the precise proportions, the canonical forms, seemed to press down on him like the mountain itself. Then Nebnifer said quietly, to start with the threshold, the bottom of the gate, a single horizontal line, and to let the rest follow from there. Panahesi drew the line. It was slightly uneven. The left side dipped a fraction lower than the right, but it was there, solid and black, on the white stone. He drew the uprights of the gate rising from the threshold, and then the lintel across the top, and then the serpents coiling around the columns, their bodies sinuous and their heads raised, and then, slowly, with the care of a man carrying something fragile across a crowded room, he drew the figure of the god above the gate, the judging deity with the feather of Ma'at, the scales of truth, the steady, all-seeing gaze. It was not perfect. The proportions were slightly off. The god's shoulders were too narrow. One serpent's coil was tighter than the other. The feather leaned a degree too far to the left. But the composition held. The gate looked like a gate. The god looked like a god. The serpents had the living energy that the best renderings of serpents always had. The sense of contained power, of watchfulness, of something that could strike but chose, for now, to hold still. Nebnifer studied the drawing. He pointed to the serpent on the right, the one whose coil was too tight, and showed Panahesi where the curve should open wider, how the body should relax into the spiral rather than clenching against it. He pointed to the god's shoulders and indicated the correct proportion with his thumb and forefinger, measuring against the grid that was not drawn, but that Nebnifer carried in his mind always, like a musician carrying the intervals of a scale. He made these corrections gently, factually, without praise and without criticism, the way a carpenter might point out where a joint needed tightening, not because the work was bad, but because the work could be better, and the difference between the two was the whole substance of the craft. Then he stood up and went to his sleeping place, and Panahesi sat with the ostrakhan on his knees and studied the corrections by firelight until the fire burned down and the camp grew grew quiet and the stars turned slowly overhead. In his sleeping place, Nebnifer lay on his back on the stone platform and listened to the wind. It came off the desert at night with a coolness that the village never felt, a dry, clean wind that carried the smell of sand and stone and the immense, ancient silence of the landscape beyond the hills. He thought about the gate. He thought about the serpent's coil, too tight, and the god's shoulders, too narrow, and the threshold line that dipped slightly to the left. He thought about what these imperfections meant, not failure, but beginning, the rough edges of something that would, with time and practice, become smooth, the starting point of a long, slow process that Nebnifer had gone through himself decades ago when his own father had handed him a brush and told him to draw. His father had been a painter, not a draftsman, a man who filled in the colors within other men's outlines. Nebnifer had surpassed him. This was not a thing he took pride in exactly, because the surpassing had not been a competition. It had simply happened the way talent happens, unpredictably, unevenly, following its own course. His father had been competent and steady and reliable, and Nebnifer had been something more, and the village had recognized it, and the foreman had recognized it, and eventually Nebnifer had been elevated to draftsman, the man who drew the lines that others followed. Now his own son was beginning the same journey, and the thing that kept Nebnifer awake, the thing he turned over and over in the quiet dark while the wind moved across the camp and the stars looked down with their ancient, patient light, was not whether Panahisi would be good. He could see already that the boy would be good. It was whether the thing that made Panahisi different, the eye that saw hoopoe birds and landscapes and the curve of the river at dawn, would survive the discipline of the craft, or whether the tradition would smooth it away the way water smooths a stone, wearing down everything that protrudes until the surface is even and unremarkable. He did not know the answer. He suspected that it was not his to determine, the best he could do, and he understood this with the clarity that comes to a man late in his career when the work has taught him as much as he has given it, was to teach the craft honestly and completely and to leave room, wherever room could be left, for the thing he could not teach. The rest was up to Panahisi. The rest was up to time. He slept, the wind blew, the stars turned, and on the ostracon beside Panahisi's sleeping mat, the gate of the underworld stood open in the dark, guarded by its serpents, waiting for whoever had the knowledge and the courage to pass through. And now let us slow down together and let the season do what seasons do, arrive. For weeks the village has been preparing. You have felt it in the air, in the way conversations turn from daily duties toward something older, something that belongs not to the work of building tombs, but to the work of being a community. The festival of Amenhotep I is coming, the great feast of the deified king who founded this place, who chose this arid bowl between the cliffs as the home for those who would build eternity. His name is spoken with a gentleness usually reserved for family. He is not a distant pharaoh. He is their pharaoh, the one who belongs to the village. In the days leading up to the festival, the women have been baking in earnest. Merit has been at the center of it, as she usually is when something requires both organization and patience. Her courtyard has become a staging ground, baskets of emmer wheat, stacked rounds of flatbread cooling on linen cloths, clay pots of honey beer sealed with mud stoppers. She has called in small favors, a neighbor's grinding stone, a borrowed sieve, an extra bundle of dried palm fronds for fuel. There is a quiet authority to the way she manages these preparations, never raising her voice, but always clear about what is needed and when. The men returned from the mountain 2 days early for the festival. This is one of the great privileges of the calendar. The foreman himself declared the rest, reading from the scribe's record of sanctioned holidays, and the crew descended the ridge path in high spirits, their tool bags lighter than usual, their voices carrying jokes and laughter across the limestone. Panahisi walked near the front this time, no longer hanging back as he did on that first morning weeks ago. Hay clapped him on the shoulder at one point, calling him the boy who paints birds, and Panahisi did not mind. There was warmth in it, and belonging. The eve of the festival falls on a still, warm evening. Imagine it, if you will, the sky deepening from amber to violet over the western cliffs, the village humming with the particular energy that comes before a shared celebration. Lamps have been lit earlier than usual. The narrow street between the rows of whitewashed houses glows with their small flames. Children run between doorways, not quite ready for sleep, and no one scolds them. Tomorrow is a day that belongs to everyone. Inside their home, Nebnifer sits on a low stool near the back room, mending the handle of a brush with a strip of linen and a dab of resin. It is a small task, the kind that fills the hands while the mind wanders. He is thinking about the festival, about the procession, about the years he has watched the god statue emerge from the shrine and move through the village, carried on the shoulders of 8 men, swaying gently as if the deified king were walking among his people once more. Nebnifer has seen this procession more than 30 times, and still something in it moves him, the moment when the statue turns the corner near the northern gate and the sunlight strikes the painted face, and for just an instant the carved eyes seem to look directly at you. He has never spoken of this to anyone. It is a private thing between him and the God who watches over the place of truth. Merit enters, dusting flour from her palms. She tells him the bread is done, more than enough for their household offering and to share with the neighbors. She mentions, almost as an aside, that she will be among the chantresses in the morning. She will stand near the front of the procession, shaking the sistrum for Hathor, singing the old hymns that welcome the god into the open air. She says this without ceremony, but Nebnifer catches the way she straightens slightly, the quiet pride in her voice. She has been a chantress for nearly 20 years. It never becomes ordinary to her. Panahisi is on the roof, as he often is in the evenings, lying on a reed mat with his face turned toward the sky. The stars are coming out one by one, pricking the fabric of the dark. He can hear his parents' voices below, a low murmur, the rhythms of a long marriage. Half the words unnecessary, the other half carrying more meaning than their syllables suggest. He is thinking about the festival too, but differently. For Panahisi, it is not yet layered with decades of repetition. It is still vivid and new. He remembers the procession from last year, the way the crowd pressed close, the sound of the sistrum like bright metal rain, the smell of incense so thick it seemed to have weight. But this year he will attend as a member of the crew. He will stand among the men, not among the children. He wonders briefly if it will feel different. He suspects it will. Now, let us move to the morning. The sun has barely cleared the eastern cliffs when the village begins to gather. The festival of Amenhotep I is not a solemn affair in the way that a royal ceremony at Karnak might be. It is intimate, communal, layered with familiarity. The shrine of the deified king stands at the northern edge of the village, a small stone chapel with a painted lintel showing Amenhotep I's in his white crown, his mother Amos Nefertari beside him, her skin rendered in the traditional glossy black that signifies her divine status. The chapel doors have been sealed since the last festival, opened only for the daily offering ritual performed by the designated priest, who in this village is often a scribe or foreman, doubling in sacred duty. Today the doors are opened wide, and the painted limestone statue of Amenhotep I is brought into the light. It is not a large statue, perhaps the height of a man's forearm, seated on a gilded wooden carrying platform, but it commands a reverence that has nothing to do with size. The statue's face is calm, its painted eyes outlined in green and black, its small hands resting on its knees. 8 men lift the platform onto carrying poles, settling the weight on their shoulders. Among them, you might notice Hay, his broad stonecutter's frame, well suited to the task. He takes the left rear pole, steadying the load, his expression focused and solemn in a way you have not seen from him before. Even the village storyteller knows when to be quiet. The procession begins, and let us walk with it slowly as it moves through the single narrow street of Deir el-Medina. First come the incense bearers, 2 young men swinging bronze censers on long chains, the resin pellets crackling as they burn, sending pale ribbons of smoke into the still morning air. The scent is sharp and sweet, frankincense and myrrh mingling with the dry warmth of the desert. Behind them walk the chantresses, and here you will find Merit. She wears a clean white linen dress, pleated and falling to her ankles, and around her neck hangs a broad collar of faience beads in blue and green, the colors of Hathor. In her right hand she holds the sistrum, a U-shaped bronze frame threaded with thin metal rods and small discs, and as she shakes it gently, it produces a sound like the whisper of wind through papyrus. Beside her, 3 other women shake their own sistra, and together the sound builds into something shimmering and continuous, a bright curtain of sound that accompanies the god through his village. Merit sings. The words are old, older than anyone in the village, hymns that praise the deified king as protector, as father, as the one who made this place and these people possible. Her voice is not the strongest among the chantresses, but it is clear and steady, and she does not falter. The melody is simple, rising and falling in gentle waves, and as the procession moves, the villagers along the street take up the refrain, so that the singing seems to come from the walls themselves, from the limestone and the mortar and the lintels painted with protective eyes. Behind the chantresses walks the statue, carried by its 8 bearers, swaying slightly with each step, the golden platform catching the early sunlight and throwing small flares of brightness against the white walls. The crowd lines both sides of the narrow street, women holding infants, old men leaning on sticks, children sitting on shoulders for a better view. There is laughter, and there are tears, and there is no contradiction between the two. This is what a festival is, the whole of a community holding all of its feelings at once. And here is something particular to Deir el-Medina, something that makes this procession unlike the great temple festivals of Karnak or Memphis. During the procession, Villagers may approach the statue of Amenhotep I and ask questions. They may seek the god's judgment on a dispute, or his guidance on a decision, or his blessing for a journey or a birth. The bearers, trained in the ritual, respond to the god's will. If the statue leans forward, the answer is yes. If it draws back, the answer is no. It is an oracle carried on human shoulders, and whether you understand it as divine intervention or as the collective wisdom of a community expressing itself through sacred theater, it is deeply felt. The villagers do not question the mechanism, they trust it. The god speaks and they listen. Naunacht is among those who approach. The old woman moves slowly through the crowd, leaning on the arm of a younger neighbor, her white hair covered with a simple linen cloth. She has prepared her question for days. She does not ask it aloud. She leans close to the statue's platform and whispers it, so softly that only the nearest bearer might hear. The statue sways, and then, gently, almost imperceptibly, it leans forward. Naunacht closes her eyes. You cannot know what she asked, but you can see the way her shoulders soften, the way her hand rises briefly to her chest as if receiving something precious and placing it carefully inside. The procession reaches the open area near the southern chapel, where a temporary pavilion of palm fronds and linen canopies has been erected. The statue is set upon a stone platform, and the village gathers around it in a wide circle. Now the formal offerings begin. Baskets of bread, jars of beer, bundles of onions and garlic, cones of incense, bouquets of lotus and papyrus flowers. Each household contributes what it can. Nebnefer and Merit have brought a painted offering platter, one of the fine ones that Merit keeps wrapped in linen in the back room, and upon it they have arranged their bread, their dates, and a small clay pot of honey. Panahesi watches all of this from a place near the edge of the gathering. He stands with the crew, with Hay and the other men, and there is a quiet solidity to his position there, a sense of having arrived at a threshold he did not notice crossing. He watches his mother sing, watches his father place the offering, watches the old woman Naunacht receive her answer from the god, and something shifts in him that he could not put into words even if someone asked. It is the recognition that these things, the work, the worship, the family, the village, are not separate. They are one continuous act. Painting a god's face on a tomb wall and carrying bread to a festival and watching your mother's lips move in hymn. It is all the same gesture, repeated in different forms, across a life, across generations. He does not say this. He simply stands and watches and feels the sun on his shoulders. The rest of the day unfolds in the way that good days do, slowly, generously, without haste. There is food. There is a great deal of food. The communal meal spreads across the open ground near the pavilion, families settling on reed mats and linen cloths, sharing dishes with neighbors, passing jars of date beer from hand to hand. Roasted duck appears from someone's clay oven, its skin glistening with rendered fat and spice. There are bowls of stewed lentils with cumin and coriander, piles of fresh bread still warm from the embers, dishes of salted fish, cucumbers sliced thin and dressed with oil, and figs, baskets and baskets of figs, dark and soft and sweet as the season itself. There is music. A man with a double reed pipe sits near the pavilion, his melody wandering in no particular hurry, weaving through the conversations and the laughter like a thread of bright color through plain linen. Two women play small hand drums, their rhythms gentle, syncopating with the pipe in a way that makes the music seem to breathe, and always beneath it the intermittent shimmer of the sistrum, because even when the formal hymns are done, someone is always shaking one, absently, the way you might hum without knowing it. And there, at the edge of the gathering, sitting on a low mud brick wall with a jar of beer and a round of bread, you might notice a Menemope. He has come from his house near the river, having made his delivery early this morning, extra water for the festival, 4 additional donkey loads carried up the path before dawn. He sits a little apart from the main crowd, as he usually does, not from resentment, but from the quiet habit of a man whose daily life is spent in the space between places. He is not a member of the crew, not exactly a villager, though he has known these people for years. Nebnifer finds him there. The draughtsman crosses the open ground with 2 cups of beer and a handful of dates, and sits beside the water carrier on the low wall. They do not speak immediately. There is a kind of conversation that happens between men who have shared work, a conversation that does not always need words. They watch the festival together, the children chasing each other, the pipe player shifting into a slower melody, Merritt laughing at something a neighbor has said, Hay lifting his youngest child onto his shoulders. After a while, Amenemope speaks. He mentions the river. He says the water has been dropping steadily and the current near the eastern bank has shifted, exposing a sandbar that was not there last season. He talks about it the way a draftsman might talk about the changing contour of a line, with attention, with interest, with the understanding that the world remakes itself constantly, and the task is simply to notice. Nebnifer listens, he nods, and then he says something about the family tomb, about the western wall where he has been painting the fields of Yaru. He says that the green he mixed for the barley fields is not quite right. It is too bright, too uniform. Real barley, he says, is not one color. It is 100 greens, shifting with the light, darker at the root, almost gold at the tip. He says he wants to try layering the pigment, a wash of malachite green first, then a thin glaze of yellow ochre on top, so the color breathes. Amenemope considers this. He says that the barley near the river does that, changes color when the wind moves through it, so it looks like water flowing through the field. Nebnifer is quiet for a moment. Then he says, yes, that is exactly it. This is how ideas travel in a small community, not through grand declarations or formal instruction, but through the ordinary exchange of people who pay attention to the world. A water carrier describes what he sees on his daily walk. A painter hears it, and something shifts in the way he holds his brush. The afternoon passes, the shadows lengthen, the music softens to a murmur. Children fall asleep in their mother's arms. The festival does not end so much as it dissolves gently into the warm evening as the statue of Amenhotep is carried back to its shrine. The doors are closed, the lamps are relit in the houses, and the village settles once more into its familiar quiet. And if you were there, if you could stand on the rooftop where Panahesi sits in the gathering dusk watching the last of the festival goers drift home, you might feel what he feels, that this day held something he will carry for a long time. Not a lesson, not an instruction, but a feeling of being woven into something larger, something that has been going on since before he was born and will continue long after he is gone. The festival was not about remembering the past. It was about being present in the unbroken line that connects every artisan who has ever lifted a brush in this place. He does not say any of this. He simply sits and breathes and lets the night come. Let us move forward now gently through the remaining weeks of Pere. The season has turned the way seasons do in the Nile Valley, not with sudden drama, but with a slow, almost imperceptible shift of light and temperature that you notice only in retrospect. The mornings are warmer than they were when we began. The desert air carries a faint scent of green growth from the river plain, where the barley and emmer wheat are standing tall now, their heads bending under the weight of grain. Pere is doing what Pere has always done, coaxing life from the receding water, filling the fields that will be harvested when Shemu arrives. In the royal tomb, the work continues. The corridors that were bare limestone when Panahesi first descended into the mountain are now alive with color. The great gods process along the walls, Ra in his solar bark, his falcon head crowned with the gleaming sun disk, Osiris in his white wrappings, his green face calm and serene, Isis with her wings outstretched, each feather painted in alternating bands of red and blue and gold. Nebnefer has drafted most of the major scenes himself, his outlines now so familiar to the crew that they can identify his hand the way you might recognize a friend's handwriting. The slight curve he gives to a god's chin, the way his reed brush makes the hieroglyphic owl with a single fluid stroke that never hesitates. Panahesi has grown into the work, not dramatically. This is not a story of sudden transformation, and the young man who grinds pigments at the end of Pere is recognizably the same young man who ground pigments at the beginning. But there are differences, and if you look carefully, you will see them. His hands move with more certainty now. He can prepare a full palette: red ochre, yellow ochre, carbon black, malachite green, Egyptian blue, and white gypsum, without consulting anyone, matching the consistency by feel, knowing when the grind is too coarse or the binder too thin by the way the pigment moves under his thumb. He has learned to read the plaster, to know when it is ready to receive paint and when it needs another hour to cure. And he has begun, quietly, under Nebnefer's watchful but unobtrusive eye, to fill in small areas of color within the outlines, a band of sky blue above a processional scene, a strip of black ground beneath a row of offering bearers. Simple work, but real work, brush to wall. There is a moment, and let us not rush past it, when Nebnefer stands behind his son in the lamplight and watches him paint. It is a brief moment, perhaps 30 seconds, no more. Panahesi is filling in the blue of a small pool of water in a garden scene, a subsidiary detail in a larger composition. He holds the brush the way Nebnefer taught him, loosely between the first two fingers and the thumb, so that the wrist does the work and the fingers simply guide, and his strokes are even and unhurried, laying the pigment in thin, overlapping washes so the color builds gradually, the way real water seems to deepen as you look into it. Nebnefer watches. He does not speak. He does not correct. There is nothing to correct. And in that silence, something passes between them that is larger than technique, larger than the transmission of a trade from one generation to the next. It is the recognition that the boy has become capable, and that this capability is not a departure from the father, but a continuation of him, a line that does not end but extends, the way a draftsman's outline extends from one wall to the next, carrying the story forward into rooms not yet built. When the moment passes, Nebnifer simply turns and walks back to his own section of the wall, picks up his brush, and continues working. If you were watching, you might not have noticed anything at all, but something happened. Something settled into place, quietly, the way a stone finds its position in a wall and rests there. On the rest days, the family tomb receives its final attention, or at least the attention that this season will allow. The western wall is nearly complete now. The fields of Yaru stretch across the plaster in their full beauty, the blue channels of water, the golden crops, the sycamore tree with the goddess Nut leaning from its branches, her hands offering bread and cool water to the souls who arrive in paradise. Nebnifer and Merit stand at the center of the painted scene, rendered in the formal Egyptian style. Profile faces, frontal shoulders, striding legs, but with small personal details that only someone who knew them would recognize. Merit's collar of faience beads, the particular way Nebnifer holds his brush, even in the afterlife. And among the family figures, little Amos, the child who did not survive, painted in the same scale as the others, walking beside his parents into eternity as if he had never left. Merit has approved the wall. She stood before it on the last rest day, her arms folded, her head tilted slightly, the posture she adopts when she is assessing something important. And after a long silence she said, "It is right." Just those 3 words, spoken quietly, but Nebnifer understood their weight. A tomb painting is not merely decoration. It is a promise. It is the family's vision of its own continuation, made visible and permanent. And Merit, who manages the household, who sings for Hathor, who remembers every face in this village, living and dead, has looked at that promise and found it true. There is, however, one space left unpainted. On the eastern wall, near the entrance of the chapel, Nebnifer has prepared a small section of smooth plaster, about the width of 2 outstretched hands, and left it blank. He has not explained this to anyone. But on the last rest day of Pere, as the family finishes their midday meal in the chapel doorway, he turns to Panahesi and tells him simply that this section is his. Panahesi looks at the blank space. He looks at his father. He does not ask what to paint. He understands. And this is perhaps the most important thing he has learned during these long weeks of Pere, that the question is not what, but how. How to place something true on a wall that will outlast everyone in this room. How to make a mark that belongs here, among the family, among the gods, among the painted fields and the waiting dead. He does not paint it today. The plaster is ready, the pigments are at hand, but Panahesi is not in a rush. He will return to this wall. He will think about it during the long shifts in the royal tomb, during the walks up and down the mountain path, during the evenings on the rooftop when the stars come out. And when he is ready, he will paint something that is his own, not a copy of his father's style, not a repetition of canonical forms, but something that carries both the tradition and the individual hand, the way the river carries both the ancient current and the morning's new water. You do not need to know what he will paint. It is enough to know that the space is there, waiting. That is how legacy works in a place like this, not as a finished monument, but as an invitation. Meanwhile, the broader life of the village continues in its gentle, persistent way. Amenemope still makes his morning walks from the river, his donkeys loaded with their clay jars. The path does not change, but the landscape around it does. The fields are taller now, the irrigation channels full, the air alive with the sound of birds that have returned from wherever birds go during the flood. He has noticed the sandbar shifting again near the eastern bank. He has noticed a family of white egrets nesting in the tamarisk grove near the canal. He notices things. It is what he does and what he has always done. The careful, patient observation of a man who walks the same ground every day and sees it differently each time. On one of his last deliveries of the season, he meets Nebnepher at the cistern again. The morning is warm, the sky pale and cloudless, the kind of sky that tells you Shamu is not far off. They exchange their usual words, the water, the weather, the state of the path. But today, Nebnepher adds something. He tells Amenemope about the green in the family tomb, the layered pigment, the malachite wash beneath the yellow ochre glaze. He tells him it worked. The barley in the painting looks the way barley really looks, shifting and alive, as if the wind were moving through it. He tells him it was his idea. Amenemope is quiet for a moment. Then he shakes his head slightly and says that it was not his idea. He only said what he saw. The idea was Nebnepher's. Neither of them is entirely right. Neither of them is wrong. This is how things work in a community. Someone sees, someone listens, someone acts, and the result belongs to all of them and none of them. The painted barley on the wall of a family tomb in Deir el-Medina, circa 1265 BCE, glowing softly in the lamplight, is the product of a water carrier's eyes and a draughtsman's hand, and a season of shared life in a small village in the desert. Nebnepher thanks him. Amenemope adjusts the ropes on his donkeys, gives a brief nod, and continues on his way back to the river. The path stretches ahead of him, the same path he has walked for 10 years, and it is beautiful and ordinary and enough. And now the day is done. Not just this day, but this particular stretch of days that we have spent together in the place of truth, walking the same paths as the people who lived here, breathing the same dry air, feeling the same sun on our shoulders. Parade is drawing toward its close, and the village is settling into the soft hush that comes at the end of a long season of good work. Let us visit them one last time as the night comes down. In the narrow house on the eastern side of the village street, Merit is putting out the lamp. She has finished the last of the evening tasks, the grain stored, the bread set for tomorrow, the loom threads weighted and still. She moves through the back room with the ease of someone who knows every surface by touch, her fingertips trailing along the plastered wall as she passes. On the shelf near the doorway, a small wooden shrine holds a figure of Hathor, her cow-horned head painted in bright colors that have softened over the years. Merit pauses there, as she does every night, and places her palm flat against the cool surface of the figurine. She does not pray aloud. She does not need to. The gesture itself is the prayer, the steady, daily acknowledgement of something sacred in the ordinary rhythm of a life well lived. In the front room, Nebnepher is already on his sleeping mat, his body heavy with the good exhaustion of a man who has spent his day with brush and pigment. His hands, even at rest, carry the faintest traces of color, red ochre in the creases of his knuckles, a thin line of black beneath one thumbnail. These are the marks of his trade, as permanent as the calluses on a stonecutter's palms, and he has long since stopped trying to scrub them away. He lies on his side, facing the wall, and his breathing is beginning to slow. Behind his closed eyes, he sees, or imagines he sees, the long corridor of the royal tomb, painted and gleaming in lamplight, the procession of gods moving silently through the stone, headed toward the chamber where the king will rest for all eternity. It is a beautiful vision, calm and ordered, and it carries him easily toward sleep. On the rooftop, Panahesi lies on his reed mat, face turned upward. The stars are very clear tonight, Sirius burning low on the eastern horizon, the great belt of the sky goddess Nut arching overhead, scattering its points of light across the darkness like emmer dust tossed from a painter's hand. He can feel the residual warmth of the day's sun radiating up from the mud brick beneath him, a slow, deep heat that will last until just before dawn. Somewhere in the village, a dog barks once and then is silent. Somewhere further away, in the direction of the river, a night bird calls, a single low note that hangs in the air and then dissolves. Panahesi is thinking about the blank space on the eastern wall of the family tomb. He is not worried about it. He is not anxious. He is simply turning it over in his mind the way you might turn a smooth stone in your hand, feeling its weight, its shape, its potential. He has time. The wall is patient. The plaster will wait. In the hills above the village, the mountain camp is quiet. The stone huts are empty tonight. The crew will not return for another 2 days, and the only sounds are the wind moving through the limestone channels and the occasional click of a cooling rock contracting in the night air. The path that connects the camp to the Valley of the Kings is a pale ribbon in the starlight, winding over the ridge and down into the darkness where the tombs wait, sealed and silent, their painted walls invisible in the absence of flame. But the colors are there, the gods are there, the blue ceiling scattered with golden stars, the green-faced Osiris, the winged Isis, the endless processions of offering bearers carrying bread and beer and lotus flowers into the afterlife. They are all there, in the perfect darkness, unchanged and unchanging, waiting for the morning when the lamps will return and the work will continue. And down by the river, in his small 2-room house among the cultivated fields, Amenemope has finished his evening meal and is sitting in the doorway looking out at the water. The Nile is quieter now than it was at the beginning of our story. The floodwaters long receded, the current smooth and dark, reflecting the stars in long trembling lines. His donkeys are tethered nearby, their soft breathing a steady, companionable sound. Tomorrow he will load the jars again, walk the path again, deliver the water again. The work does not change, but the light changes, and the river changes, and the fields change, and the sky changes, and somehow that is enough to make each day its own. He watches the water for a while, then he goes inside, lies down on his mat, and closes his eyes. And that is where we will leave them, these people of the place of truth, the draughtsman with color in his hands, the jantress with hymns in her memory, the apprentice with a blank wall and a future, the water carrier with his patient daily walk, the stonecutter asleep in his house with his family around him, the wise woman in her small room with her dreams and her remedies and her long, long knowledge of this village and its people. They will wake tomorrow as they always do, and the work will continue. The royal tomb will deepen into the mountain. The family tomb will receive its final marks. The river will bring its water, and the desert will hold its silence, and the painted gods will watch from the walls with their calm, eternal eyes.